James sat in his car, staring at the dimly lit house in front of him. It was once a home filled with laughter, warmth, and the kind of love that made everything else in life seem insignificant. Now, it felt like just another building, a place where two people coexisted without truly seeing each other. He sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. He had spent the last hour driving around aimlessly, not wanting to go home. The thought of stepping inside, of facing Emily's cold indifference, was suffocating. It hadn't always been like this. There was a time when they couldn't bear to be apart, when every conversation was filled with shared dreams and whispered confessions. But those days felt like a lifetime ago. James unlocked the car door and stepped out, his feet dragging as he walked toward the front porch. He hesitated before turning the key in the lock, hoping, perhaps foolishly, that tonight would be different. That Emily would look up from her book or phone and smile at him like she used to. That they'd talk, really talk, instead of merely existing in silence. But as he pushed the door open, the house was dark except for the faint glow of the TV. Emily was curled up on the couch, a blanket draped over her legs, her eyes fixed on the screen. She didn't acknowledge his presence. "Hey," he said, forcing his voice to sound casual. She gave a small nod without looking away from the TV. James swallowed hard. He didn't know why he even tried anymore. Every attempt to bridge the gap between them was met with indifference, as if she had already made peace with the idea that they were beyond saving. "I'm going to bed," he muttered, even though he knew she wouldn't respond. As he climbed the stairs, his heart felt heavier than ever. How had they ended up like this? And more importantly, was there anything left worth saving? James lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sound of the television downstairs. Emily was still awake, still immersed in whatever show she was watching, completely detached from him. He turned to the side, glancing at the empty space beside him. They hadn't shared a bed properly in months. Even when she did come upstairs, she would sleep facing away from him, as if even in sleep, she wanted to keep her distance. The weight of their silence was suffocating. He thought back to the early years of their marriage, the stolen kisses in the morning before work, the late-night talks about their dreams and plans for the future. He had believed they were unbreakable, that their love could withstand anything. But somewhere along the way they had lost themselves. Maybe it was the stress of work. Maybe it was the small resentments that had built up over time, left unspoken until they formed an invisible wall between them. Or maybe, and this was the thought that scared him the most, they had simply stopped trying. James rolled onto his side, closing his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind was too restless, drowning in thoughts of what could have been and what might still be. The next morning, he woke up to the sound of running water in the bathroom. Emily was already up, getting ready for the day. James sat up, rubbing his face, and decided to try again. As he stepped into the kitchen, he saw her making coffee, her movements automatic, her eyes distant. "Morning," he said, leaning against the counter. "Morning," she replied, but her voice lacked warmth. James hesitated before speaking again. "I was thinking, maybe we could have dinner together tonight. Just the two of us." Emily paused for a moment, as if considering his words, then sighed. "I have a lot of work to do." It wasn't a refusal, but it wasn't an acceptance either. It was the same non-committal response she had given so many times before. James felt frustration rising in his chest. "Emily, we can't keep going like this." She finally looked at him, her eyes tired. "Like what?" "Like strangers." There was a beat of silence before she turned away, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "I have to go. We'll talk later." But they never talked later. James sat at his desk at work, staring at his computer screen without really seeing it. His mind kept replaying the morning's conversation, or rather, the lack of one. He wanted to fix things, but how could he when Emily wouldn't even meet him halfway? During lunch, his coworker, Daniel, noticed his distracted state. "You okay, man?" James sighed. "Just having a rough time at home." Daniel nodded knowingly. "Marriage trouble?" James gave a humorless chuckle. Something like that. Daniel leaned in. Look, I don't want to pry, but sometimes an outside perspective helps. What's going on? James hesitated, but then the words spilled out. It's like we don't even know each other anymore. We barely talk. We don't fight, but we don't connect either. I feel like I'm living with a ghost of the person I married. Daniel was quiet for a moment before saying, maybe she feels the same way. James frowned. Then why doesn't she say anything? Maybe she's waiting for you to. That thought lingered with James for the rest of the day. That evening, James came home to find Emily sitting at the dining table, flipping through some papers. He took a deep breath and sat across from her. We need to talk, he said firmly. She glanced up, her expression unreadable. About what? About us. About whatever this is. He gestured between them. Emily, I feel like we're just coexisting. We used to be happy. I don't know what happened, but I want to fix it. I don't know how. Emily set her papers down and exhaled slowly. James, But before she could continue, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Daniel. You need to hear what this guy told me today. Changed my whole perspective. Call me when you can. James frowned at the message, but for now, his focus was on Emily. What were you going to say? She shook her head. Never mind. It's late. We'll talk tomorrow. But would they? James wasn't sure anymore. The next morning, James woke up to an empty bed again. He ran a hand over his face, exhaustion sinking deep into his bones. The emotional distance between him and Emily was becoming unbearable. Something had to change. He just didn't know how. After getting dressed, he checked his phone. Daniel had texted him again. Call me when you get a chance. Seriously, man. You need to hear this. James sighed and decided to call Daniel on his way to work. As soon as his friend picked up, James could hear the excitement in his voice. James, listen. I met this guy yesterday at a coffee shop. We started talking and I told him a little about your situation, without using names. What he said really stuck with me, and I think you need to hear it. James raised an eyebrow. A random stranger at a coffee shop? What exactly did he say? Daniel hesitated, then said, he told me that most people in failing marriages make the mistake of assuming their spouse is the problem. But what if the real issue is that neither person feels seen anymore? What if the key isn't fixing what's broken, but remembering why you fell in love in the first place? James frowned. That's vague. I thought so too at first, Daniel admitted. But then he asked me something that hit me hard. He said, when was the last time you truly looked at your wife? Not just saw her but looked at her. Noticed her the way you did when you first fell in love. And man, I couldn't answer. I realized I'd stopped paying attention. Maybe that's what's happening to you too. James swallowed, suddenly feeling uncomfortable. Had he stopped seeing Emily? Was that part of the problem? He also said, Daniel continued, that love doesn't disappear. It just gets buried under routine, resentment, and silence. But it can be uncovered if you're willing to dig. James felt a strange, uneasy stirring in his chest. He wanted to dismiss it as just another cliché, but something about it rang true. That night, James came home earlier than usual. He found Emily sitting in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book in her hands. She looked beautiful. Exhausted but beautiful. Had she always looked this tired? Had he ever really noticed before? For the first time in a long while, James really looked at her. He noticed the way her brow furrowed slightly in concentration, the way she absent-mindedly tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the way her shoulders tensed as if she carried an invisible weight. He cleared his throat. Hey! Emily glanced up, surprised. Hey! You're home early. Yeah, He hesitated, then sat down across from her. Can we talk? Emily closed her book slowly, her expression wary. About what? James took a deep breath. About us, she sighed. James, I don't want to fight. "I'm not trying to fight," he said gently. I realized something today. I think I've stopped seeing you the way I used to. And I think maybe you've stopped seeing me too." Emily blinked, clearly taken aback. "What do you mean?" James ran a hand through his hair. "Remember when we first got together? How we used to talk for hours? How I used to notice every little thing about you? Your laugh, the way you always bite your lip when you're nervous. The way your eyes light up when you talk about something you're passionate about." Emily's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. James leaned forward. "Somewhere along the way, I stopped paying attention. And I think you did too. We got caught up in work, in stress, in all the little disappointments that built up over time. But what if we're not broken? What if we just stopped looking at each other the way we used to?" Emily swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the book in her lap. "James, I don't know. Just think about it," he said softly. "I don't want to lose you, Em. But I also don't want us to keep living like this. If there's still something left, if you still want to try, I'm willing to do whatever it takes." There was a long silence. Then finally Emily nodded. It was small, hesitant, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, James felt something close to hope. For the next few days, James made a conscious effort to change things. Not through grand gestures or elaborate apologies, but through something much simpler: paying attention. He started waking up earlier, just to watch Emily before she got out of bed. She always stretched her arms slightly before opening her eyes, blinking at the ceiling for a few moments as if preparing herself for the day ahead. He noticed how her fingers absent-mindedly traced patterns on the bedsheet when she was deep in thought, how she sighed softly before getting up, as if carrying a weight invisible to everyone but her. At breakfast, instead of burying himself in his phone, he asked her how she slept. The first time she just shrugged. The second time she muttered a quick, "Fine." By the third morning, she hesitated before answering. "I had a weird dream," she admitted, stirring her coffee. James looked up from his plate. "Yeah. What about?" Emily glanced at him as if surprised he actually cared. "It was strange. I was in our old apartment, the one we had before we bought this house. Everything looked the same, but when I looked in the mirror, I didn't recognize myself." James frowned. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," she said, shaking her head. "I just looked different. Younger maybe. Happier." James felt a pang in his chest. He knew what she meant. Somewhere along the way they had changed. Not just as individuals but as a couple. The lightness they once had was gone, replaced by exhaustion, disappointment, and unspoken words. He reached out, covering her hand with his. "Emily, do you miss who we used to be?" She stiffened slightly at the touch, then let out a shaky breath. "I miss feeling something, James. I miss us." Her voice cracked slightly, and James felt his heart ache. This was the first time in a long while she had been honest about her feelings. He squeezed her hand gently. "I miss us too." That evening, James came home with something he hadn't done in years. A photo album. Emily looked up from the couch as he sat beside her, placing it on the coffee table. "What's this?" "Our story," he said simply. She hesitated before flipping open the first page. The first photo was of them in college, grinning at the camera. His arms slung around her shoulders. Emily let out a small laugh. "I forgot about this one. This was the day we skipped class to go to the lake, wasn't it?" James chuckled. "Yeah. You convinced me it was necessary for our mental well-being." He smirked. "I wasn't wrong." They turned the pages slowly, reliving their past in snapshots. Their first apartment, their wedding day, their honeymoon in Italy. The moment they held their puppy for the first time. Laughter echoed in their voices as they reminisced, but James also noticed something else. Emily's eyes softened, her shoulders relaxed. She was here, present. Then they reached the later photos, and the shift was almost palpable. James traced a picture of them at a family gathering from 2 years ago. They were both smiling, but something about the image felt off, forced. This is around the time things started changing, Emily murmured. James nodded. Yeah. There was a long silence before Emily spoke again. James, when did we stop trying? James swallowed hard. I don't know. I think it just happened. We got comfortable. And then comfortable turned into distance. Emily nodded, looking down. I don't want to be just comfortable. James reached out, cupping her face gently. Neither do I. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch for the first time in what felt like forever. And in that moment, James knew. This wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning of something new. That night, James lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. For the first time in a long time, he felt something other than despair about his marriage. He felt hope. But hope alone wasn't enough. He had to act. Emily was already asleep beside him, her breathing slow and steady. He turned onto his side, watching her for a moment. She looked peaceful, but there was still an invisible weight on her shoulders even in sleep. He longed to take that weight off her, to make her feel safe with him again. But how? The next morning, James woke up early and decided to do something different. He took the day off work. Emily looked confused when she saw him still in his pajama pants, pouring coffee in the kitchen. You're not going in today? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Nope. She blinked. Why? James hesitated, then gave her a small smile. Because I realized I've spent years prioritizing everything except us. And I don't want to do that anymore. Emily's expression softened, but there was still hesitation in her eyes. Come on, James said, reaching for her hand. Let's go out. Just the two of us. Emily hesitated. Go where? Anywhere. Anywhere but here. Just for a few hours. She bit her lip, considering. James, I don't know if. No pressure, he interrupted gently. But if there's even a small part of you that wants to remember what it's like to have fun with me again, just say yes. Beat of silence. Then finally she nodded. They ended up at the park where they used to go on long walks when they were dating. James had almost forgotten how much they used to love it. The fresh air, the open space, the feeling of being away from the noise of the world. Emily walked beside him, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. It was chilly, but she didn't seem to mind. I don't even remember the last time we came here, she murmured. James smiled. Me neither. For a while they just walked in silence. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was different. Then James spoke. Emily, he said softly, I know I haven't been the husband you deserve. She glanced at him. James. No, let me say this, he cut in gently. I got caught up in everything else, work, stress, my own frustration, and I stopped putting in effort. I let the distance grow between us, and I'm sorry. Emily exhaled slowly. You weren't the only one who stopped trying, she admitted. James looked at her, surprised by her honesty. I let the resentment build up, she continued. I stopped telling you what I needed because I convinced myself you didn't care. And when we started feeling more like strangers than partners, I just accepted it instead of fighting for us. Her voice cracked slightly at the last part, and James felt his chest tighten. I miss you, James said, his voice raw. Emily stopped walking. She turned to look at him, really look at him. I miss you too. And just like that, something in the air shifted. A door that had been closed for so long was finally opening again. That evening, they returned home feeling lighter than they had in months. As Emily stood in the kitchen making tea, James watched her from the doorway. For the first time in forever, he didn't feel like she was someone he had lost. He felt like someone he was finding again. He walked up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. She froze at first, as if unsure how to respond. But then, slowly, she leaned back against him. James buried his face in her hair. I love you, Emily. She let out a shaky breath. I love you too. And for the first time in what felt like forever, those words didn't feel like something they said out of habit. They felt real. That night, James found himself unable to sleep. He lay on his side, watching Emily as she rested peacefully beside him. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was watching someone who was slipping away from him. Instead, he saw his wife, the woman he had built a life with, the woman he had once been unable to imagine living without. And he realized something. If they were going to truly fix their marriage, it couldn't just be about nostalgia. Couldn't just be about remembering who they used to be. They had to create something new. He knew that he couldn't expect Emily to suddenly trust that things were different. Words meant little when they had been thrown around so carelessly in the past. She needed proof. So the next morning James made a plan. He started small. At breakfast, he prepared Emily's coffee exactly the way she liked it. 2 sugars, a splash of milk. When he placed it in front of her, she gave him a surprised look. "You remember how I take my coffee?" James chuckled. "Of course I do." She lifted the cup, studying him over the rim. "It's been a while since you made one for me." "I know," he admitted. "I'm sorry for that." She took a sip, not saying anything, but the small smile on her lips told him everything he needed to know. That weekend, James suggested something that truly caught Emily off guard. "Let's go to therapy." Emily nearly dropped the book she had been reading. "What?" "Couples therapy," James clarified. "I think we should go." Emily frowned, closing the book. "James, are you serious?" "Yeah." She studied him, as if trying to gauge whether this was just another one of his fleeting attempts to fix things. "I don't want us to go back to the way things were," James continued. "I want to understand what went wrong. I want to know how I can be better. Not just for you but for us." Emily hesitated. "Therapy means having to face things we've been avoiding for a long time." "I know. It means we might hear things we don't want to hear." "I know." Emily exhaled. "And you're really willing to do that?" James reached for her hand. "I'd rather face hard truths with you than live in silence without you." For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then finally she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's try." The first therapy session was harder than James expected. Sitting in that small office, with a stranger asking them questions about their marriage, felt intimidating. Emily sat beside him, tense but willing. Their therapist, Dr. Avery, was gentle but firm. "Tell me," she began, "if you could each describe your marriage in one word, what would it be?" James thought for a moment before answering. "Distant." Emily's answer was immediate. "Lonely." James flinched at the word. Dr. Avery nodded. "Can you tell me why?" Emily hesitated before speaking. "Because even when we're in the same room, I don't feel like we're together. It's like we coexist, but we don't connect anymore." James swallowed hard. "I never meant to make you feel that way." "I know," Emily said softly. "But that doesn't change the fact that I did." James turned to look at her. "Did?" She gave him a small smile. "I don't feel as lonely anymore." And for the first time since they walked into that office, James felt like they were truly on the right path. Over the next few weeks, therapy became a space where James and Emily confronted the things they had been avoiding for years. James learned that Emily hadn't stopped loving him. She had just stopped feeling safe in their love. Not in a physical way but emotionally. She had felt unheard, unseen, and unappreciated. Emily learned that James hadn't grown distant because he didn't care, but because he had been struggling with his own fears of inadequacy. He had felt like a failure, and instead of leaning on her, he had pulled away. They both realized that their biggest issue hadn't been falling out of love, it had been falling out of communication. So they started rebuilding. James became more intentional about their time together. Instead of zoning out on his phone after work, he would ask Emily about her day. Instead of assuming she was okay, he would check in, really check in. Instead of waiting for big moments to show his love, he found joy in the small ones. Making her tea when she was stressed, holding her hand when they walked down the street, leaving little notes in her book when she wasn't looking. And slowly things changed. Emily started trusting him again. She started opening up about things she had buried for years. She started reaching for him, not just physically but emotionally. And James knew. They weren't just repairing what was broken. They were creating something new. One evening after dinner, Emily stood by the kitchen window, watching the sunset. James came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. She sighed, leaning back against him. "We're getting better, aren't we?" James kissed the top of her head. "Yeah, we are." She turned in his arms, looking up at him. "I was scared, James." "I know," he said softly. "I thought we were too far gone. That we had lost too much." James cupped her face, his thumb brushing her cheek. "We haven't lost anything that we can't rebuild." Emily smiled. And this time it wasn't forced. It wasn't filled with doubt. It was real. And for James that was everything.